Despite the growing number of reports about climate change's future effects, environmental issues have mostly failed to make their way into the American political arena. Nathaniel Stinnett has an idea to change that. A recent story for Washington Monthly details the political operative's mission to propel environmentalists to the polls in the hopes of making climate change an unavoidable issue. I recently spoke to Stinnett about his efforts. He is the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. So why do you think that the environment needs this kind of sole political focus, and how is your organization trying to do that?
Well, whenever you poll likely voters for any election, climate change is almost at the bottom of their priorities. And that obviously has an impact not just on who gets elected, but on how policy is made. But here's the thing. It's only a low priority for voters. We've realized that there are a whole bunch of non-voters who care deeply about climate change. So if we're able to get those people to start voting, we could have an enormous impact on policymaking at every level.
And so one of the ways that your organization, EVP, tries to turn out voters is through face-to-face interactions and direct contact. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, a lot of the reason is it works better. People are less likely to answer their phones these days. They don't necessarily read their mail. But if someone knocks at your door, chances are you're going to open it up. And so face-to-face contact that we've been doing for 30 or 40 years in this business still ends up being the most effective and the most efficient.
Well, how would you define success for EVP going forward, and what would be the long-term effects of that success?
So first, let me talk about the long term, because that's our true goal. We're not some secret election-winning organization. We care more about changing the electorate. And so we define success after 3, 4, 5 years in a particular state, making climate change and other environmental issues a top 3 voter priority. And we think when that happens, politicians will fall all over themselves to lead on environmental issues, because politicians go where the votes are. It's that simple.
Well, the story in Washington Monthly compares the Environmental Voter Project to the NRA in terms of appealing to voters on issues that are outside of a party's platform. Is that part of convincing Republicans to focus on climate issues?
So we don't actually convince anybody to focus on climate issues. I'm not going to claim that that's not important. It's extraordinarily important work. But what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is find the people who are already persuaded, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or independents, and they're just not voting yet, and we concentrate on changing their behavior. Because changing someone's mind is so hard and so expensive. But finding someone who's already with us and just tweaking their habits and making them a better voter is a lot cheaper and a lot easier. So that's what we do.
And so how hard is that to identify these environmentalists who you say are just not coming out to the polls?
Right. So it's not as hard as you might think. We poll over 10,000 people per state and use a lot of data that's on voter files to really narrow in on the people who don't just care about climate change, but list it as one of their top priorities. And then, as I said, comes the best part. At that point, we bypass all the hard stuff in politics, persuasion. All we can do is focus on one thing, and that's getting these environmentalists to vote like their life depends on it.
Because they're registered already. They just haven't come out to the polls.
That's exactly right. They're already registered. They just don't take 14 minutes out of their day on election day to go and vote.
Do we know why? Are there not other issues, one might ask, that in addition to the environment, folks who are already registered to vote might decide that taken together with their environmental concerns might propel them to the polls?
So that's a great question. And the honest answer is we don't know why these people aren't voting. Any behavioral scientist can tell you it's really easy to set up an experiment to figure out how to get someone to take an action. What's really hard is to figure out why they're not taking the action. The best you can do is ask them. And when we poll environmentalists who aren't voting and ask them why they don't vote, they lie their pants off. Overwhelming majorities of them say, oh no, I vote all the time. And as you might know, Elaine, who you vote for is secret. But whether you vote or not is public information. It's public information. And so it's really hard to figure out why people aren't voting. But what we do know is how to get them to vote.
So it's interesting, you started the Environmental Voting Project back in 2015, but I wonder, how has the Trump presidency and this administration changed your work at all? Has it?
So it hasn't changed our focus. Our focus is still, let's get as many environmentalists to vote as possible in every election, because no matter which politician you're focused on, they're always going to go where the votes are. That might sound cynical, but it's just arithmetic. Like, politicians go where the votes are, or they're not politicians anymore. But one way in which Trump has changed what we're doing is we have seen a flood of volunteers and donors coming out of the woodwork because he's really lit a fire under the environmental movement and politicized people who were never politicized before.
Nathaniel Stinnett, it is a fascinating concept to think about, expanding the electorate in ways that you say have not been done just yet. Well, we'll check back with you and we'll see what happens in a few years. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.